Welcome to a conversation on chapter 3 of my PhD, the Christology of Rudolf Steiner. This chapter is, I think, in my rereading of it, it's very big, a lot of content, but it sort of comes to the core of the argument of, has Steiner contributed to this sort of systematic aspect of theology, or if so, how? And so maybe a first place to start would to be even say, well, we've looked at his scholarly by his sort of academic or intellectual biography as the first lens. Last time we looked at the theological sort of framework of his work, trying to define that in the hermeneutical key and the philosophical model for his theology. And now the question is, can I claim that Steiner was systematic, even though his published works were not? Because that's part of the problem of reading Steiner, is he didn't actually make a systematic production of his Christology. It was bits and pieces here and there that people have to sort of put together himself. And, part of my argument would be, oh, well, he that's part of his method, is to let people do the work. But from an academic point of view, that's just not quite good enough. So I thought I might start off trying to give a couple of definitions. So what would systematic be? What do we mean by systematic? And at first, it describes the research methods. So that's what we're trying to work out is, did Steiner develop a research method? And as I said, this is such a big chapter that the last 3 sections, we're probably going to have a second hour on this in a fortnight's time, and dig deeper into the actual methods that I've pinpointed for him. But so, just from a very simplistic point of view, what is biblical theology? Which would be synthesizing the teachings of Scripture, whereas systematic theology is more practical. It kind of formulates these teachings for today. It's an attempt, and each tradition, we could say, has its own systematic theology. You can go into Catholic, or you can go to Pannenberg, who's more Lutheran, and there would be many different approaches to putting what we've learned from the biblical scholarship into a systemized way to address how we might reflect upon the issues that we meet in our current world. And so I think systematic theology, and I think Pannenberg also would agree with this, is it needs to be updated for every generation. But Pannenberg goes down the track, and this is where he sort of says it's about reformulating the sort of agreed truths for a modern generation. And I think systematic theology needs to be a little bit more scientific in that it can update itself. So, and this is where I've over time differentiated between dogma and doctrine. I think this may be just for our audience. People here in this conversation may understand the difference between dogma and doctrine. But doctrine is more, what systematic theology is trying to wrestle with. This is our idea. I've read this and I've had this idea. And so it sort of revises itself as science informs it, as other things come into it. The doctrines grow and change. So just even the doctrines of understanding the 7 days of creation is emerging as an understanding that it wasn't 7 24-hour periods. I mean, that's an outdated doctrine. Whereas a dogma is something that I met certainly in my youth, which is sort of like a decree of, I grew up Roman Catholic, so we had decrees like, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which was, we can't understand it, but we will take it on the tradition and on faith that it is true. And one day we may come to understand it. But it becomes then, with dogma, it becomes anathema. So this is quite important for understanding the issues that the academy has with Steiner, is that many of his themes are anathemas, like Nestorianism, which is a really important aspect to understand Steiner's work, that he's coming at it from this sort of I don't even know if you can call Nestorius a Gnostic, but he had a definite picture, which is quite central to this chapter, is that it wasn't that Christ didn't become human through the birth through Mary. It wasn't monophytism, which is, Christ and Jesus are synonymous. The God became the Son of God through the birth with Mary. Whereas Nestorius and Steiner brings this teaching back. He says, Steiner suggests if we want to make progress in understanding this, we need to go back, or we need to revisit that teaching that the fully human and the fully divine aspect of Jesus Christ is the fact that Jesus was the Son of Mary, and that was fully human. His version of that's quite complex, but we can come to unpack that later on. But that at the baptism in the Jordan at the age of 30, the Christ being, the fully divine being, entered into Jesus. And so you have this two Genesis points of Christ Jesus rather than one. And that has been made anathema. And I suppose in the starting point of this chapter, I'm looking at it to be able to describe Steiner's methods. We have to understand, this question, was Steiner a Gnostic? Because that in some academic points of view would make him, we don't want to read him. And I think that's been a resistance. But is there something that's happening in theology that opens that up? And I'll sort of, in the first part of the chapter, say there is. McGinley, I quote her saying in the Routledge volume of the early church, where she sort of heralds the chapter on Gnosticism. She said it's really interesting to see that, in the earlier editions of this massive volume, this was called Gnosticism, whereas now we're calling it Inner Challenges of the Church. And so even though we have, we can now discuss it a little bit more openly because we have documents that we can read in and of themselves. So someone like Elaine Pagels has done a huge amount of work to bring our sort of reading of the Gnostic texts in and of themselves, the Nag Hammadi library, and say, we can now not just take the teachings that said, those teachings have been eradicated and we're telling you they were wrong. And we can now actually go and read them and call upon them. And she develops this sort of idea. I don't know if it's her idea exclusively, but I certainly met it through her, of Paul teaching gnostically for those who knew the language. So there were certain languages in each community that he was sort of addressing as a sort of a metaphysical background to their traditions. But he also taught antignostically, more secularly, where you could just say that was, for those who were not initiated into the languages of the mysteries of those cultures, could also approach that. And I found that quite liberating, actually, because Paul has often copped a lot of, he's just a he's a bit of a crazy guy. Whereas now you can sort of say, well, he actually was also talking in this Gnostic sense. And Steiner I sort of posit that Steiner, in his language, rode on that sort of Gnostic side of Pauline Christology, especially when it comes to the sort of the soma, psychikon and the soma pneumatikon. So the sort of the soul body and the spirit body, or the first Adam and the last Adam, that he was pointing to this differentiation that came through the work of the Christ upon the bodies of Jesus. So there's that whole aspect of it, that there is a sort of a renaissance within the academy, where the Gnostic texts are receiving a sort of a sense of a review, and there's maybe a slightly more open window to looking at, Nestorius or Docetism, or all these different kinds of things that have been declared as wrong, not orthodox, but more of a polydox kind of approach, where we can rely more on our own experience to understand these mysteries. So that was the sort of the first opening side to that. And then I sort of bring the traditional impasses of Steiner, that they've been decrees against reading theosophical, anthroposophical, mystical teachings because they've been, they are Steiner's reflections on his own experience, which is one of the criticisms of Gnosticism. But to review Gnosticism, I've argued that we need to sort of look at it, and I think feminist theology has been really, really fantastic in this, certainly when I was reading it maybe 20 years ago, is that there's this sort of hermeneutic of skepticism plus a hermeneutic of grace. So the skepticism is, this is all just being closed down by the academy or the churches to say this is how we have to understand it, and we read any doctrine through that lens. Is this just a closed group of people telling us how to think of it? But at the same time, we need to review these teachings through a sense of, well, maybe there was some grace working through each of these communities. So when you look at the Gnostic communities, each of them have a slightly different approach. And I think what Steiner would want us, or so his approach would be, is we need to sort of read the early church history before the council started codifying things, in a sense of what was worth looking at, what part. So, for example, Steiner would say in Nestorianism, the fact that we had the fully human in Jesus and the fully divine in Christ, and they came together in the baptism. He says that's something we need to, or he would suggest would be an important review of a Gnostic teaching. At the same time, also looking at what was not okay. So which practices were not okay. So, for example, where certain denial of the value of being embodied as a human being, or the sexualization of the practices that sort of gave Gnosticism in the Hieros Gamos kind of department bad names, but they've all been sort of pushed together. And he says, I think he's sort of saying, don't confuse the good teaching with the practices that sort of marginalize that community in the larger world. And I think I find that a good way to sort of try and take a look at it. So again, using this systematic approach of what methods are we using to approach reading things that have been, possibly the doors where they're no longer made a non-theme, anathemas. They can now be approached. So I think that's a little bit of a modern approach, or a sort of a contemporary approach to Gnosticism, where we come to, Steiner's understanding of gnosis, which I think is the Gnostic understanding in itself, is, how we come to understanding through personal experience. And I bring examples, for example, of liturgical theology that calls, the experience or the art of the art form of theology in liturgy is where we have the God experience, and that experience is our coming to integrate our experience of the divine is primary theology. Reading other authors is an important part of theology, but it's the second step. So, coming from that Pauline papaisme, which is, I am convinced by my experience. A faith that is convinced by experience is the core, one of the cores of Pauline Gnostic teaching, which of course, there's a number of churches and communities that really embrace that very, very strongly. How do we, come to experience by reading the scriptures? How do we come to experience of the divine in a number of ways? Even, I think, maybe more contemporarily through the scientific process. How can we experience the numinous, or the divine working through the laws of nature, is something that I think is emerging. And Steiner did develop a method by which we can approach that in a sort of scientific research way, which I have called contemplative phenomenology, which I think I'm going to leave for tonight, not to bring that in. So we then move into another sort of area, which is the second part of the chapter, which is Steiner's mysticism and his analytic mystical theology. And I think was most influenced there by Sarah Coakley's work, along with Christopher Curlin's work, where there are a number of theologians who are sort of, we could say, creating a hybrid systematic theology rather than just saying classic, but we're going to add in mysticism and analytical philosophy. So we can bring these various ways of approaching things into a way to describe things. And some really creative work is being done. And so I sort of compare Steiner's approach to people like Hildegard of Bingen, Teilhard de Chardin, but there's other people, more contemporary people, Ian McGilchrist. We've got Richard Raw, many people who are branching out of just redefining agreed truths into a contemporary way of describing it, actually saying, can we go into it a little bit more deeply through these other approaches. And so I think with Sarah Coakley's work and Hildegard of Bingen's work, I sort of named 4 things that I think are quite central to describing a systematic or a research method, which was gnosis, so understanding through experience as a starting point, mysticism, which is a deeply pondering, and Sarah Coakley really describes the silent prayer of just letting the silence be where Christ works to bring understanding is one of her sort of core practices. I mean, she says, sit for 20 minutes every day silently, quieten the mind and let Christ transform you, which is a very key point to the development of the spiritual senses, which is part of the method. And then the work of using the art, so symbol, allegory, to be using not only scripture but art and symbol as a point of contemplation to allow higher, what does it mean to sit in front of a crucifix, or what can we learn just by contemplating an icon or a tree, all those kinds of things where we can actually use that contemplative method. And then that whole sense of Pauline and John being a Christ mysticism. That's an important key point, that it's not just God mysticism or a nebulous mysticism, but it's a real mysticism that is a Christ mysticism. We could come to explore that a bit. So the question of the spiritual senses is if the subjective mystical experience can be given an objective basis. That is one of the sort of core dilemmas that I faced in describing this chapter, because the mysticism has always just been, well, that's just someone's personal experience that they're trying to make into a theology. And Steiner's, I've sort of tried to describe this method, is that we can actually have this personal experience, and through this research method, make it into a more objective basis. And that would be part of that. So how have I described that? The third part. So in this method, the method of exegesis, or we could call this the method of research, where I'm trying to say, look, Steiner was working systematically in this sense, but in a mystical, analytical way. So the analysis is how we is the process by which we bring our personal experience into language that other people can critique and go, I agree, I disagree. That's always been a real issue. I mean, someone like Teresa Avila had, John of the Cross to help her write down her experiences. Hildegard of Bingen was an author in her own right, which helped us very much, but it was always artistic and poetic. So there's 3 aspects to this method, and I've called this the first part, this differentiation, again, out of the Nestorian kind of picture. The first part is the imitation of Jesus, and then the imitatio Christi. So that's a bit of a differentiation, again, that, maybe more classically read people might go, what's the difference? But I've sort of done this sense of the imitation of Jesus is what the Jesus person would have had to have done to accept the Christ being at the baptism, which I've called this process of selflessness, which I think correlates somewhere with Sarah Coakley's silent prayers. How do I, the kenosis of emptying out, just as Christ, as Paul says, Christ emptied himself to become fully human. So too did Jesus have to empty himself to receive that. And so there's a sort of a dual, an indication of a dual process, that at first, as a human being, as a person of faith, as a person on the journey, reading the scripture, going to, on a process of wanting to be more Christian, how do we actually school selflessness as a process at the beginning? The second part of the method is the development of the spiritual senses. And the third part is then how do we really use scripture and symbol and art, language, dialogue to allow ourselves to articulate the personal experience in the mystical. So the analysis through art, the analytical side of the method coming into hold. So it becomes more, comes into conversation with current and historical thought around these things. And I think I might leave it there for tonight. One of the things, I'll jump to the end of the chapter, because this was a question that Nicola asked me at one point that I thought was, really built it into this chapter. What about the dangers of false initiations and, misrepresenting your experiences? Did Steiner work with that at all, or was it all just put into, the personal experience realm? And I really, think it's very important that to understand that he did say we need to work with instruction on how to do this. We need to work with the community, and there are conditions of training. He writes about that in some of his books, about how do we remain in a healthy reason within our personal experiences, that and we could say we need a supervisor. I know I brought this up at a conference and someone said, yeah, but all the churches do that, which is true. Absolutely. Traditions have their way of spiritual direction to help people remain not having, false initiations or difficult initiations. And the other question is, well, we'll come to the second question maybe next month, which is, what do I do while I'm developing these spiritual senses? Because that's a lot of hard work. What do I do in the meantime? So yeah, maybe that's enough of a sort of an introduction to where we are in this part of the chapter. And next month, we'll look more into the detail of those other three subsections. How's that for a bit of a review?
Thank you so much for that, Jude. It's heartening listening to you, having just reread what you're doing, and it's like pulling out the richness of the first half of the chapter that you've written there, really. And it feels special to be part of this little community trying to unpick this. Now, I've got loads of questions that I'd like to dig into, but Raynand also wrote a few questions. So I thought I'd actually invite Raynand. Would you like to? You had a few questions on the basis of your reading of the first half of chapter 3 there. Would you like to throw them at us? Throw one of them at us?
Yeah, so technically it's a question because can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So for example, the Pauline's epistemology, so that is something that I want to know more, because that is not something I'm not quite sure. So I ask question here: how do these ideas fit into a bigger conversation about theology, segueing Steiner's anthroposophy, Steiner's teaching? So I just want to know more about the Pauline's epistemology, because that is something that I just came across quite recently. So that's one of the many questions I put here.
Yeah. It brings in naturally a huge conversation, because you've got epistemology, which last time we talked about, that is, how do I know? How do I come to know? That brings in the other question of, transcendental and ontology of the German idealists, which I think, Angus, was one of your questions that you put in there. And so, sit back and let's spend the next 3 months talking about this. Because, epistemology and the Pauline epistemology, and I think this is really important because when we look at where Steiner fits in, he's part of the continental philosophers, which is different to the Anglo-American kind of approaches to things. I remember when I was studying my master's degree, and we read a couple of excerpts by Moltmann, Jürgen Moltmann, and everyone was like, I have no idea what he's talking about. And I went, this is my bread and butter. This is how I study, because I studied in Germany, and there's a different metaphysical assumption in the continental philosophy. Angus, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, it's just, I wanted to flag that sort of like after you've sort of like unpacked a little bit, I'd really like to add some more meat to what Radian's got to say.
Keep going for a bit. So the epistemology, and I mean, this is part of the thing is, how do you try and keep it simple when because these things can get very difficult, but there is, I mean, from the point of view of epistemology, there is the process where we come to knowledge a priori or a posteriori. So the epistemology a priori is Steiner says, or so-and-so says, they are angels. And so we get this knowledge, and then we need to go out and verify it through experiment or experience. So you could say science works along this kind of way as well, that there's, someone posits law, and then they have to go and find the experiential foundations for that law. Whereas, that feeds then into coming to what I think is the Pauline or the Gnostic kind of epistemology, which is a posteriori. So you have an experience, and if you need to find the language for it. So you walk, you're walking along, and something happens. I mean, you could say, when you're a child, you put your hand on a hot plate on the oven, and you have the experience, and then you start to work out, don't put your hand on hot things. That's a very simplistic version of it, but you can see how definitions of things and experience of things feed into each other, and there's a myriad of ways to do that. But I think the Pauline epistemology is very much placed, and Steiner's epistemology is placed into experience. And how does that dialogue in a larger context? Again, in Steiner's time, I think the thing, this is what I sort of promoted, is Steiner was concerned with the historical quest for Jesus, which was, basically pushed. I think we're now into a fourth quest for the historical Jesus, where we've gone through various phases of it. But he saw it being quite driven by historical criticism. If it's not in the text, if it's not archaeologically provable, if we can't find physical evidence for it, we can't trust it. And this is really part of the question is, this is where the ontology comes in as a question of, and I just want to sort of give you a bit of a little simplistic working picture of what ontology is. And you could say ontology is the study of existence, but it's also about how do we determine if things exist or not? So how do we go about determining if something exists? Now, you could say that's just way too abstract. But at the same time, we're also then trying to look at what is a transcendental ontology if we're looking at Pauline epistemology, which is, we can understand empirical objects. In other words, I can see the computer screen in front of me. I know it exists because I can measure it, I can weigh it. And these categories come originally were defined when Aristotle started his categories. But then we also have the whole thing, for example, of we can understand mind-dependent objects, but Immanuel Kant said we cannot cognize the mind-independent world. So the transcendental is, can we, and we come back to that sense of the numinous, can we actually cognize, put into rational language, things that are not dependent on spiritual experience? Do we have a way of processing non-sensory experience in a way that the rational mind can get it? And that, I think, is a really important interface with where biblical scholarship goes, where theological scholarship goes, where science goes. I mean, scientists have hunches about, and they then go and do a lot of hard work to bring that into the mind-dependent definition, and not just on the evolution of species, not just on light or atoms, but on really important, metaphysical laws. And we struggle to get beyond the metaphysics of what we call materialistic monism, which is, unless it's material, we can't trust it. And I think there's now a real sense of trying to push this epistemology that Immanuel Kant, in a way, closed down. So we have a whole lot of categories there that we could unpack, but that's a little bit right now where I think this could be quite exciting in the field of theological discourse, is finding ways to trust intuitive understanding. I don't know, Nicola, would you have anything to say? I'm sure you'd have something to say on that.
I think that's great. I was just thinking though that the gospel reading for this Sunday is where Jesus came and stood amongst them, and then he opened up their minds, you know, how everything fit together. And how what he meant in the whole history of, since Moses and all that kind of stuff. And it's sort of like what we're talking about here, isn't it? That he opened their minds. He didn't just give them a long lecture,
Yeah, exactly. And how do we do that?
Yes, I know.
Saying to
presumably, the fact that we can do it at all has to do with the Spirit's connection, and it's something like what Sarah Coakley talks about, with being quiet and contemplative for even 5 minutes, helps us to be receptive to the
Thank you.
So I'd like to return back to Renan's question and answer it from a slightly different perspective, to actually show how rich this theme is, even within let's call it mainstream church, Catholicism, Protestantism, and everything. If you dig into I'm referring to Pauline gnosis or anti-gnosis, as you talk about it in your PhD, Jude, that if you look up ideas on positive and negative theology, that's the same thing, in my opinion, and I think you'll agree with me, Jude. Cataphatic and apophatic, this is another word for the same thing. So we're not dealing with anything mysterious. The church the churches have a rich history of trying to unpick this complex, deeply personal relationship that we have with God through Christ. So we can pick up there. And if we look at this cataphatic, apophatic, positive, negative, one way of describing it was exactly as you were doing there, Jude. It's the difference between conceptual and aconceptual. Aconceptual is the experience without the thinking behind it. We have to find ourselves within that state. You talked about Coakley talking about just sitting in front of a cross for 20 minutes and what does it mean, not trying to cognize it, experience it, and then see what cognitive thinking fruits drop out of the experience. So there's a huge amount of different directions you can like look at. But I think one of the nice things that you've done here in this in your work, Jude, is to point out that once we've recognized this pattern, gnostically, antignostically, apophatic, doesn't matter, then you see it popping up everywhere and you go,
absolutely,
how come I never saw it before? How come I never saw it
Yeah.
before? Because it's been
Yeah.
there, so like staring me in the face the whole
Yeah.
time. It's like, it's it, being in a forest and not seeing the trees, or vice versa, whichever way it happens to be.
And
Both are true at the same time.
In that sense, Sarah Coakley's work just blew my mind when I first read it, because it's kind of like the open secret, because she wrote this with her colleagues, this thing of the Western tradition of the spiritual senses, as it's always been there. And they've gone back from, you know, Plato right through the Western tradition to say everyone's been looking for it. But we haven't actually created a full doctrine on it yet. So let's work on that. And you just go, oh, there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. Yeah, it was very, very beautiful experience. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'd like to like continue to build on that, and also try to begin to like tackle a little bit like Nicholas' question, which you referenced about. So like, okay, how do we manage first? What do we do to ensure that it's a good initiation, it's a truthful initiation, rather than something that actually leads us like further down the path of darkness? And I'm going to start off with, it seems a little bit off field here, but I think you'll begin to understand once I unpack it why it's so relevant. There's a series of lectures, 214, called The Mystery of the Trinity. And for one of the things that Steiner does in that, he talks about an early Middle Ages, I think he was a priest, but he was certainly a thinker, Martinius Capella. And he talks about how he was one of the last people that's experimented, so like in a very weak way, but this idea that the 7 liberal arts were real beings. They are not fictions of our imaginations. They are beings with agency, and these are the beings with agency that shaped so like European Western civilizations, like thinkings on education for a millennia or more. And waking up to this idea that there are real spiritual beings, of which Christ is obviously the ultimate, the highest, is part of that opening up process. That the importance of faith in this process is, first of all, waking up to this idea that there is this supreme being, Christ, who has this ability, as Nicholas was describing, to open us up. And the faith is the first step along that path, and our responsibility is to develop that relationship with that being. At the same time, one of the things that Steiner points out in Knowledge of Higher Worlds, for example, is like that every step you take along, so like along the path towards trying to become clairvoyant or spiritual development, it's like 3 steps morally. So this moral aspect is deeply important to the process, which is something you look at so many thinkers in especially in Catholicism, but I'm thinking specifically about Aquinas, how it is our moral, the clouds in our morality that stop us actually from seeing the truth, from experiencing the truth. And that's why this is so important, that morally we continue to work on improving ourselves. And there, if people feel tempted, understandably, to select to promote the become clairvoyant without that moral, developing that moral aspect, then Steiner will quite clearly tell you, like the church will tell you as well. Yeah, it's like exactly. you are really running the risk of like succumbing to forces that you don't want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we'll probably delve into that a bit more deeply next time, because that's central to that sense of, the imitatio Jesu, of selflessness, that moral fiber. Yeah.
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 And there's the other point that I'd like to make, which is still in my mind connected to what you're saying about Nestorius, is that these old heresies or anathemas. That you, in one part, you mention Gnosticism and Pelagianism.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, because if you dig into that and you find out why the Catholic Church denied Pelagianism, but you actually find out that they do accept something called semi-Pelagianism because of the essence, the importance of the free will in the personal path. So as soon as you begin to scratch away at the surface, you see, there are this token word Pelagianism. It's actually rich, and serious thinkers within the church, they've been grappling with this since the 5th century, basically.
I think modern scholastic, and certainly in my experience, modern or current theological and thinking is very sincere on discernment and critique, and not just. I mean, I know Nicola pulled me up a few times on some of my language, because you can't just categorize things too quickly. You've got to actually unpack it more fully, and I think that's all part of the where I think the average, or where we as a culture need to learn from the academy on how to actually listen and read, and with more discernment is the word I'm looking for, and not just immediately yes or no it. Yeah. Craig, did you want to say something?
No, I just think it's fun. It's a really good point around how quickly we are to put labels on things and put things in a bucket. I mean, I was thinking about your comments around the difference between dogma versus doctrines.
Yeah.
And it's almost like dogmas often today, it doesn't seem like it needs to be handed to us with as much wrapping around it. It's almost like we take it as dogma straight away, a lot of these things. And you've almost got, that coming from different areas as well. So it really is the ability for us to kind of remain open to these things, overlay our own experience, consider it, do our own research, etc., before we actually sort of go too far down a particular path.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, certainly in my experience with the New Zealand's Christians in Science group, even, unpacking scientific dogma, where, the unquestionable truths can be critiqued, and we all grow through making sure that remains open. Yeah.
So if we go back to Reynand, you asked the question. So you've been listening to us talking away for 20 minutes. It would be really interesting to hear your reflections on what you've heard us say, and where it takes you, and then you can lead on to your next question if you like.
Yeah. I'm using this headphone. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, reflecting on the conversation just now, I noticed that there is a high frequency of using the term experience. Yeah. Which experience is also space-time. So looking at the statement and the question, helping us understand theology. Theology is the study of God in a very scholarly and organized way, which is highly scientific. Reflecting on that, I think, to better understand the particular God or Jesus, it has to be highly experiential. And it seems to me that, based from this conversation, that God himself is space-time. He owns space-time. Yeah, that's one of my reflections with S.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a little bit profound. I'm trying to construct a very simple statement, not highly technical. But one of my reflections is So overall, it's highly experiential to deeply understand theological aspect, and experience itself for me is space-time. And so
Yeah,
based from this conversation, God is space-time himself. He owns space-time. So like for me, God is not a figure or very figurative alone, but God can be understood, or he could be more than a figure. Yeah, though we understand from the Christian and Catholic perspective that he is more than figure, but based from this conversation, it's sensible. Yeah, he is more than a figure, or just more than a Jesus as a figure. It's a metaphysical nature. Yeah. Very broad. Yeah, I can't really explain. I can't explain it. I don't know what particular word.
Yeah, I think you sort of trying to describe this impasse between the material and the non-material, or the mind-based or non-mind-based dilemma we face. And it was one of the problems, or one of the challenges I had in writing the thesis, was a lot of Steiner's teachings on Christ and God a priori. It's like, this is Christ was a different person to Jesus, and at the same time, I'm trying to describe a method by which people can come to that knowledge through their own experience. So there was this, trying to translate this revelation of Rudolf Steiner that stands a little bit left of field for most Orthodox theology. And at the same time, pushing what you're saying is, how do we actually describe a method by which, or how did Steiner work in such a way that he had this systematic research method? Is it describable? That's what I'm hearing in your observation there.
Right. You use the term describable, because again, a lot of criticisms in this Steiner movement, in the anthroposophical view, especially in the scientific community, because it's highly esoteric, a kind of esoteric, which is only few people understand. So from my perspective, from lensing from my thesis, so I'm trying to find a word or a statement, or create a statement that is very describable and very comprehensive for laymen, for ordinary people, because highly technical, very philosophical, very, very profound. So if you are speaking to people on the street, so I'm thinking how I'm going to explain this to this kind of people, because I'm trying to reach them out, because I need to explain to them for public engagement. So, but anyway, back to what I said, reflecting on the conversation today, that, space-time, God is more than space-time, and it's just
I think,
difficult.
I really appreciate what you're saying there, because I think within the anthroposophical circles, there's a lot of mythology around how special Steiner's method is. But what I'm trying to do is sort of kick it off its pedestal a little bit and make it a little bit more in tune with other methods that are emerging in the world. It's not that far away. Sarah Coakley being one where you eventually have to go, what are we talking about? Why are we trying to differentiate this so much in the anthroposophical world? I mean, this is part of the point of a thesis, is to critique the anthroposophical sense of, this is so, but not actually taking time to define it, or give it a framework, which is what I've tried to do here, and saying, we've got this Goethean method, but not really pinpointing it down to A, B, C, D. And when you do that, there's a lot of other places and people in the world that are very similar in method. And I think that's really helpful to point out. So as you say, so that when we as people who are speaking in another context, it doesn't sound so out there. But that's a languaging thing, Craig.
Yeah, I was just going to say to Reynard's point around maybe you don't have to get people the whole way there as well.
Yeah.
You know, there's elements of you know, whether it's coming from a purely science point of view, talking to someone who has a different perspective, or whether it's coming from an anthroposophical perspective to someone who views the world scientifically, there's elements of meeting people where they are and bringing them part of the way along the journey, which may be close enough or closer than where they were, which then opens up other doors for them to experience themselves, rather than actually having to go, here's the story, here's the whole story. There you go and chew on that for a little while. I think there's elements where, you know, you can bring people part of the way there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Angus.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to your point about Sarah Coakley, who I'd actually never heard about before. But the important point you're making, that anthroposophists aren't unique in this, or theosophists, or also like any other stream. And actually, it's when we actually can recognize the common ground that we have with them, that's when community building happens. In one part, I think it was page 66 or something like that, you were talking about the importance of culture, and I think this is an essential part. There's like, if we are approaching the truth, it's like through Steiner, we'll also be able to like recognize that same truth that's being spoken by other people that have no knowledge whatsoever of Steiner. And that, for me, is the beauty of it's like how this does. It opened up doors. I am like so grateful that I happened to meet Steiner, but I realize it doesn't work for me. But then it's like later, because I've had that way into a way of thinking about religion and my relationship to life, the universe, and everything, I can at a later stage find that connection with other people, so like who have those same questions. So it's one of the things that I really value from reading your work here, this inviting people into a conversation, and hopefully this conversation will continue to grow when the other people realize that we do have common ground, a lot of common ground.
And not just even with, you know, to go even further, not just with other Christian traditions, but Sufism and, you know, other mystical traditions have their own methods for the same ends. Yeah.
I mean, the practice that's most common in New Zealand society anyway is forms of yoga and meditation. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what the spirituality that young people are engaged with.
Exactly.
Is opening yourself up as well. I mean, there are all these questions about what you're opening yourself up to, but it's still interesting. And then I think, you know, when Raymond was saying, you know, how do you tell people in the street, you know, these things? I mean, the problem really is that you have to have people practicing stuff like this, and you have to take them, you know, off the street, really.
But you do that, don't you? You've got a mentee kind of program for that. Is that kind of?
Oh, we have a mentoring program that's really it's really to read the material, read stuff. You know, it's not. We haven't gotten into anything as esoteric as this yet, but it's really just to sort of expose people to a wide range of young people to a wide range of literature, you know, in science and theology.
So that's an important part of the schooling, isn't it?
But it opens up all these questions, you know, about how we know.
Opening their minds.
Yeah. Right. We just do it a little bit more painfully than the Holy Spirit does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to add to this conversation, I remember based from while I was reading the literature in anthroposophy, the Steiner mentioned about the idea of concept and perception. Perception comes first, if I'm not mistaken, before concept begins, because concept is coming from the percept of perception. So therefore there must be an observation, or a sense, or a perception before an image in the mind. Otherwise, image cannot begin. So that means that like for example, in our action, for example, in doing so, in practicing. So I believe before doing, there must be a mind or something to sink in the mind before it starts to manifest in a physical reality, or action, we call it action. So I think consciousness, is very necessary, of being aware of what is that, or at least to begin from the mind, to begin the act of the action. So that's my addition. So
that's a great transition to the second part of this chapter. And hour is up, but that whole sense of exactly what you've been talking about is the development of how the spiritual senses take that into the spiritual experience. Yeah. So would it be okay to end there for tonight?
Yeah, I think we should. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
I'm not quite as much of a pumpkin as I was when